Folklore is full of ancient tales that have made their way down to us through the centuries or even the millennia sometimes. But how did they persist through the medieval period? Did people believe in fairies during the Peasants' Revolt? Today's guest, Francis Young, has written a book about how folklore survived alongside the Christian Church in the Middle Ages. It's called Twilight of the Godlings, and he's going to tell us all about it. Welcome to Future Imperfect. So I think probably the best place to start is for you to introduce yourself to us and talk about this book, Twilight of the Godlings, because I am fascinated by the medieval period. And one of the things that I perhaps feel I don't fully grasp is how religious or otherwise, or how spiritual the average medieval person would be. And I'm always interested in the average medieval person. We talk about kings and heroes all the time, but what's your average Joe in the peasant farm thinking? So do you want us to just start with the intro and then we'll wander through the landscape of medieval myth?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Francis Young. I'm a historian of religion and belief. So I work on people's belief in the past, really from late antiquity right the way through to the sort of Tudor and Stuart period. I'm interested in folklore. I'm interested in kind of conventional beliefs of religion and things like that, but I'm also interested in the slightly stranger aspects of what people ended up believing. And my most recent book is about the shadowy origins of Britain's supernatural beings. Now, we have various names for those supernatural beings. We might call them fairies, or we might talk about giants or dragons or whatever. But of course, they have a long, long history stretching way back into the distant past when they've been known by other names. And so the book is really an attempt to try and work back to the origins of some of the things that we take for granted in British folklore today.
And so how would you define a godling? Sort of not a god, but a little god in a way?
Yeah, it's not a very common word. It essentially means a small god. That was, of course, Terry Pratchett's phrase, the idea that there are these small gods, these minor deities that are much less than the great deities of the heavens or the Christian God or whatever. And of course, Terry Pratchett was quite right about that, looking at ancient religions. When you look at the Romans, the Greeks, they had the Olympians, they had these senior gods and goddesses, but they also had these lower gods. And sometimes these are associated with the earth, they're associated with nature. Sometimes they're kind of half animal, half human. They might fluctuate according to number. You're never quite sure how many of them there are. So you've got the satyrs, you've got the fauns, you've got the nymphs, and they're very unstable beings, and they're sort of gods and yet not really gods because you don't have temples to them. They don't have a priesthood. They aren't worshipped in any kind of regular way. And I use this word godling because it embraces those beings of the ancient world, but it also embraces the strange, ambiguous beings that we get in later folklore, like the fairies, for example. So all of those, in my view, can be described as godlings.
That's really interesting. So they're not human, absolutely different from us. They don't work on the same rules or the same boundaries or even perhaps the same logic as us. And yet they're not the supreme powers that you can appeal to. They're more kind of chaotic forces of nature in some ways. I mean, would that describe them accurately? They're the manifestation, a personification of things that are different than human but aren't quite gods?
Yeah, absolutely. They are not quite human and they're not quite divine. So they're these beings that are somewhere between worlds and between states of existence. And they're very much associated, as you say, with nature, but they're also associated with human destiny and fate. And for that reason, they became associated very early on with children, with newborn children, and with childhood. And that, curiously enough, is something that continues with fairies today. We associate fairies with childhood, or indeed with childishness, the idea that believing in fairies is a childish thing. But originally it was because these beings, they are present at the birth of every human being in some sense. They weave the destinies of human beings. But as you say, they are totally non-human. So they're not to be compared to ghosts, for example. Ghosts are shades of the human dead, and they're not like witches who are human beings who acquire supernatural powers. They are, yeah, a kind of an extra additional category of being.
Back in their origins in antiquity, would you describe their character as sort of capricious? And does that capriciousness follow through their history, do you think? Is it shared?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Pan is perhaps the classic example from the ancient world. This utterly chaotic god who is half human, half animal, a kind of a strange mixture of human and animal features with goat's feet and horns and so forth, who lives out in the wilds. He doesn't usually have temples, he doesn't usually have cults, and yet he draws people to go out in the wilds and participate in these kind of orgiastic revels in wild places and lose their minds. You know, people go mad, hence we get this phrase that still survives into our language today of panic, the idea of being in some sense possessed by Pan. And that's something that you find throughout the ancient world. So you get the idea of nympholepsy. So if somebody spends too long at a spring or a well, then they might become possessed by the spirit of the nymph that dwells in that well and become, if you like, a sufferer of nympholepsy, which is a kind of madness brought on by the nymphs. And so, yeah, they're these kind of very unstable, unpredictable beings. And of course, that continues into the folklore much later on about the fairies. You don't mess with the fairies. If you cross them, they've got a very, very ruthless conception of justice. They will exact terrible punishment for any kind of offense, but they might also reward you. And so you get all these folk tales about, you know, people who will do some slight service for the fairies and they're rewarded with a lifetime of great wealth, and somebody who slightly offends them and ends up being disemboweled. And so you've got this sort of strange sense that they're like us, but they're not really like us. They're only seemingly like us.
I mean, we talk about them being from the ancient world, but where do you think these ideas originate? Do they come from how we understand the world about us or how we try to make sense of it? Why did they come into being in our imagination, or are they real? Probably not, but you know.
There's one school of thought on this, which I think is interesting. I'm not sure I agree with it 100% because I think it's very difficult to prove. But there is a school of thought that these godlings are in fact older than the gods of Olympus, as we might think of them, the sort of the pantheon of senior gods and goddesses, because they reflect an older stratum of religion, of human religious behavior, and that's animism. So, animism being the idea that natural things like trees, rocks, rivers are imbued with a kind of divine spirit in and of themselves. Now, as religion changes, as polytheism is introduced, possibly by the Indo-Europeans, as the Indo-Europeans come in from the steppe, the ancestors of those Indo-European languages that become Germanic and Greek and Latin and so forth, they bring with them this idea of senior gods and goddesses who inhabit the sky. But the older beliefs continue under the surface, but they become personified. So a figure like Pan could be interpreted as a kind of a way that animistic people coped with and made sense of the imposition of this new polytheistic religion on their way of thinking and their way of worshipping. And so they turn these beings into gods and goddesses. And yet they're very different from the normal pantheon of gods and goddesses because they're worshipped in the wild, because they retain their connection to nature, because they almost lack the same level of defined personality as the polytheistic gods and goddesses. So, you know, we can say who Mercury is, who Jupiter is, Juno is, and these kind of great gods and goddesses. They have defined functions and roles, but that isn't really true of these godlings. And the godlings also, they exist in multiples. So they can be anywhere. You know, there's a nymph in every well, and they're different nymphs. They're not the same nymphs. And it's this idea that, yeah, they seem to belong to something older than polytheism. That's the theory.
That's kind of interesting. So when somebody, if we're talking about it from a political perspective, when a new set of gods comes and is introduced, however that may be, maybe by an authoritarian regime or just by things that come out of society, rather than completely trying to throw away the old gods, which might actually be impossible, you sort of diminish them and you sort of make them odd and other, and you say they're not nearly as powerful as our new gods, which you obviously need to pay taxes to and worship. And I wonder whether that trend has continued. So I'm thinking of the typical trend from polytheism through to a handful of gods that are powerful, through to one god that is all powerful. And even when you talk about the Christian religion or the Islamic religion, there are intercessors as well. There are sort of more than human beings that have not powers exactly, but abilities. People talk about the saints, and they talk about, in some cases, you talk about demons and devils. So there are lesser powers that are definitely not gods in those religions, but could be seen in the same way. Do you think it's a sort of human psychology of control that's overlaying all of this a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a human need here, which is quite fundamental. And I think that when we see the same patterns repeating again in human religious behavior, one explanation is to say, oh, well, they were influenced by another culture or they acquired this. But I think a lot of the time, the explanation that's more plausible is simply that humans just think this way, humans behave this way, humans do this. And I think that's the case with Godlings. I've mentioned about how it might have been an expression of an animism surviving under polytheism coming in later. But I think it's also true that when Christianity arrives and when Islam arrives in the Near East, you get a survival of these beliefs under the radar. Although in Islam, it's a bit different because in Islam, these beings are actually embraced and incorporated directly into the theology of Islam as the jinn.
Ah,
So these beings who are neither good nor evil or could be either, which doesn't exist within Christianity. Christianity has a deeply dualist view of the spiritual world, meaning that spiritual beings can only be either good or evil. They can only be demons or angels. And in the ancient world, of course, the daimons, which are these spirits of the air that are lesser than gods but greater than human beings, they're morally neutral. They could be good or they could be bad. Socrates says, I have a good daimon who advises me and makes me wise. But the Christian church, nevertheless, has to contend with the fact that at the folk level, at the popular level, people carry on believing in these beings. And the fact is that they survive not so much because people were determined that they should survive and were resisting the church. I don't think it's so much that. I think it's more that the church and its teachings couldn't reach some niches of belief. So the analogy I always use for this is, when Oliver Cromwell's soldiers went into churches and started taking pot shots at statues and images of the Green Man or whatever that were surviving up in the rafters, there were some that were just too high up for them to reach. And I think this is true also of belief in these kind of godlings and small gods. It's just too difficult for the church to reach it. And I think also if you're living a very simple kind of subsistence farmer type lifestyle, your everyday concerns aren't really to do with matters of kind of the existence of the cosmos and where the world came from and what's the eternal destiny of your soul after death. Your immediate day-to-day concerns are with how do you prevent illness and disease in your animals? How do you make sure your crops flourish? How do you placate the powers of nature that make your life totally unpredictable and mean the difference between life and death, depending on whether your harvest fails or your animals die? And I think that these beings simply continue to exist in people's minds because they need them. Spiritual beings are there for a reason because people need them. And so it takes a very long time for the saints, for example. You mentioned the saints as similar kind of beings. It takes a long time for the saints to kind of take the place of these godlings. And in some places, they never really do.
so if we go back to sort of focus on the medieval period, which is my particular passion, is the evidence that these beliefs were genuinely held alongside the sort of slightly chaotic Christian, because we were obviously well before the Protestant Reformations and the Bible being in English or in the local language. Is that the evidence that you've managed to gather about the medieval period?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about the sincerity of people's belief in these beings, although whether belief is the right word is itself an interesting debate to have about the Middle Ages, because it's really only at the Reformation that we get the insistence of the church on what I would describe as confessional belief. So the idea that in order to be considered a Christian, you have to have internalized a kind of defined faith that you yourself have made a personal decision to follow. And that really wasn't the case in the Middle Ages with the vast majority of people. It was simply you follow the practices of your ancestors. If your ancestors happen to be Christian, you follow the Christian practices of your ancestors. If your ancestors weren't so Christian, then maybe you follow those practices as well. So I think it's more communitarian, it's more collective, and it's less individualistic than what we find later in the 16th century onwards. But yeah, I mean, people are afraid of these beings. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Preachers are constantly warning people against consorting with fairies. with incubuses and similar kind of beings. So the preachers clearly believe that they're real. And it seems that the people do as well. I mean, you've got extraordinary examples from church courts in England, which are the kind of the disciplinary courts of the church, which don't have the power to punish you with execution or anything like that, but they do have the power to humiliate you in front of your community.
Right.
And a lot of people are brought before these courts for superstition. And in some cases, the superstition is that they are trying to receive assistance from the fairies, whether that's to heal people or to find buried treasure. They are engaging in some kind of relationship with the fairies. And this is obviously, from the point of view of the church, unacceptable. But it's not as bad as, for example, being a necromancer who conjures up the devil. Because fairies, there's still some ambiguity about how bad they really are.
And was there any indication of how they fitted into the Christian? I mean, did priests just say, yes, they exist, they're not really mentioned in any of our works, but they're sort of part of what we have to deal with in the society we're dealing with? Is there anything like that?
Yeah, there's a kind of folk theology that develops around fairies, which I find fascinating because Christianity in and of itself doesn't obviously make room for them. You know, I've talked about how dualistic Christianity is, but people come up with these alternative stories. And the two main ones, one of them is developed in Ireland. And this is the idea that when Satan rebelled against God at the beginning of creation, some of the angels sided with Satan, some of the angels sided with God and St. Michael, and some of the angels remain neutral. And it's these angels that remain neutral. Clearly, they have to be punished by God because, you know, they failed to side with God. But they also didn't side with Lucifer. So God says, well, I'm going to throw you out of heaven like the evil angels, but you won't fall as far as they do. So the neutral angels fall to earth, but not down to hell. And so they become the fairies. And so in Irish tradition, the fairies are not necessarily bad, but not necessarily good either. And they are not human, but they kind of long to be human, because if they were human, then they would, you know, have salvation available to them, but they don't. And so they're kind of jealous of humans, and yet they have these kind of magical powers that humans don't. And the other story is developed in Scandinavia, and this is the story of the Holdu folk. The Holdu folk are the hidden folk. So these are the elves, still very much an active belief. In Iceland, for example, people still talk a lot about elves. And the story is that when Adam and Eve were thrown out of the Garden of Eden, they have several children, and God comes to visit to check up on how Adam and Eve are getting on after they've been thrown out of paradise. And some of the children are dirty because Eve hasn't got round to washing their faces and their hands. And so she said, get behind me, hide, so that God doesn't see you. And these hidden children, who are sons and daughters of Eve, they are punished by God for being hidden, if you like, and they become the progenitors of the elves, who are ever after doomed to kind of hide from human beings and live in clefts of rocks and mountains and things like that. And there's another account that's given in Beowulf. So this is presumably what English people in the Anglo-Saxon period believed. In Beowulf, you've got the idea that elves and giants and orcs and all these monstrous beings, they are descendants of Cain. So when Cain is punished with the mark of Cain, which nobody knows what the mark of Cain was, but it's something that Genesis talks about, that his descendants become more and more monstrous over time. And of course, J.R.R. Tolkien drew on that idea for the Lord of the Rings, the idea that, you know, the orcs are kind of tortured elves who've been transformed. That's all from Beowulf. So yeah, there are various theories that develop, but none of them are given official sanction.
So it's fascinating. It sounds like it's a post-rationalization of something that they couldn't really get rid of and needed to manage somehow. If you're looking at it from from the perspective of an organization, it's like, this isn't going away, guys. We need a way to deal with it somehow. Also, the idea that just because kids have got dirty faces, they somehow get cursed by God seems to say quite bad things about God in terms of his attitude, because kids need to get dirty and run around and get grubby, and it seems sort of strangely authoritarian. I suppose God can be authoritarian to sort of punish kids for being kids. That's extraordinary.
I suspect it's sort of functioning as a bit of a morality tale, as sort of the Scandinavian preoccupation with hygiene and cleanliness. I think it probably might speak to that.
Yeah. Are these fairies, the fae, or whatever they might be called, do they feature in medieval churches or in symbolism? You vaguely touched on the Green Man, and I think that's an interesting symbol, but it's also quite controversial, I think, about where it starts. And I personally love the idea of the Green Man because it seems a chaotic, ancient figure. Is there any of that that you've discovered?
I think it's really frustrating because we don't know exactly how medieval people imagined the fairies. The earliest depictions that we've got of beings specifically said to be fairies are actually from the 16th and 17th centuries.
Ah, okay.
So we don't know. I mean, it's absolutely possible that a lot of the grotesques and gargoyles and strange beings that we see in medieval manuscripts and medieval churches and things like that, that they are representations of what people thought elves look like, for example. But it's important to bear in mind that this word fairy is quite a late arrival. It doesn't appear until the 15th century. It's a borrowing from the French. So in French, it's les fées, the fairies, but féerie is the realm of the fairies, fairyland. Of course, fairyland becomes very important in the vernacular romances that are written in French originally, these elaborate kind of 12th century stories about knights and King Arthur and Morgan Le Fay, obviously being the key fairy character in those romances. But it takes a long time for that word fairy to replace elf. And in the north, it never does. So you go to Yorkshire, it's still all about the elves. You know, that's never changed. But yeah, in the south of England, the fairies replace the elves. And I think with that comes a slightly different conception of what fairies are compared to elves. So fairies, because of the French influence and because of the influence of the romances, the fairies are often imagined as these beautiful ladies who gradually kind of diminish in size over time. Whereas the elf has got a slightly more earthy feel to it. The elves might be pretty ugly. You know, they might be kind of monstrous gnomes and things like that. So although the two words kind of technically mean the same thing, they've got slightly different connotations. And it seems that medieval belief was quite unstable. You know, what's an elf? What's a fairy? We're not quite sure until around about 1500. And around about 1500, we get something approaching a recognizable fairy that's starting to emerge. And it's from that that we get, for example, Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, you know, which is almost the canonical portrayal of fairies in English culture.
And by sort of classic fairy, do you mean the sort of tiny Tinkerbell figure with gossamer wings? Is that what you're thinking of as the sort of classic fairy, the Cottingley fairies at the bottom of the garden type of image?
No, that comes even later.
Oh, okay, right.
I'm thinking of fairies that might be of human size or might be slightly smaller than normal human size, but not significantly. But they are ruled by a king and a queen. So the king and queen of the fairies, who might be Oberon and Titania, as they are in Midsummer Night's Dream, they are imbued with magical powers. You might be able to make contact with them. They live under the earth. They have their own kingdom. Time stands still or moves very slowly in that kingdom. It's those sort of features that we find in a lot of fairy tales. They're more like the fairy tale fairy
Okay.
rather than the, I suppose, what I would call the Cottingley fairies type fairy, the one who's got the gossamer wings and is about the size of a large insect. That's almost the fairy of modern popular culture.
Right. Okay.
And it's something which takes a lot longer to develop. There are hints of it by the end of the 17th century. A lot of it is to do with stage representations and pantomime representations of fairies during the 18th and 19th centuries. And then, of course, J.M. Barrie comes along with Peter Pan, and Peter Pan very much sort of cements the idea of fairies as these kind of gossamer-winged, rather twee beings. And then Disney picks that up and it sort of spreads globally in sort of visual media. But yeah, that's quite a late conception of what fairies are like.
Okay. Interestingly, though, Tinkerbell was quite capricious, wasn't she, in that work? Even though it's a lot later, they carry that willfulness, that jealousy, that sort of rage, almost rage of a tiny creature through quite strongly in there. I think it's kind of interesting that you might have a line of the Danelaw. They might have elves north of it and fairies south of it, you know, northeast, southwest. I wonder whether one could map it almost to that sort of splitting of the British Isles in that period of time. Probably could a little bit. Probably gets very fuzzy in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, when fairy comes to replace elf, there's an argument that actually it didn't replace elf, that it replaced a previous word in the south of England, which was much older and does go back to that Danelaw division, which is the word puck or pook. Now, of course, Puck, we tend to think of as a specific character in Midsummer Night's Dream, but it was actually just a generic term for a spirit, for a kind of trickster spirit, for a domestic sprite, for a kind of fairy. And there are various place names around the country, like there's a place in Gloucestershire called Pucklechurch, where you've got this idea of a puckle, a little puck. And that goes way, way back to the early Anglo-Saxon period. So we know people believed in that. But that, again, is only found in the south of England. It's always elves in the north of England. So, yeah, there does seem to be variation in the names used and possibly also variations in belief as well.
I love the idea that they're somehow other as well, and that their domain is outside time and space. And of course, that solves a lot of problems with where do they live and how can you find them. But is there some indication that people thought they might live in mounds and therefore the mound building, yeah, the Neolithic mound building, does that tie in to this whole legendarium?
Absolutely. I think that a fascinating theory about the fairies, this was advanced by Catherine Briggs, who's a great folklorist of the 20th century. And I think there's a lot of truth to this potentially, is that fairies are also, to some extent, a kind of remnant of ancestor veneration, which goes back all the way, of course, to the Neolithic period in Britain. The idea of the long barrows, the building of these monumental features in the landscape to commemorate the dead. A lot of archaeologists would now say that Stonehenge, likewise, was primarily associated with the dead. And all these places in the landscape which people knew were in some sense connected with burial of unknown cultures, unknown great heroes and ancestors and so forth. And it's possible that the fairies were in some sense a reflection of this. In Scotland, particularly, you've got the idea of the fairy ride. And the fairy ride is at certain times of the year. So at Halloween and Midsummer, for example, if you stood at the right place in the landscape that was near some kind of sacred landscape involving a cursus or mounds or barrows of some sort, then you would see the fairies riding. And with them would be the spirits of the dead. So the idea that the dead, in some sense, go to join the fairies. And if you watch for too long, you yourself might be drawn into that fairy ride and doomed forever to ride out with the fairies. And so, yeah, it does seem to reflect some kind of pre-Christian understanding of an afterlife, where it's not going to heaven and being with God, but in some sense being condemned to wander around the earth, or the idea that the dead actually live as human beings inside the mounds where they've been buried. I mean, if you think that prehistoric people would bury goods and beer and food and supplies with the dead, they must have believed that in some sense the dead would literally carry on living under the ground as if they were carrying on with a normal human life. And fairy belief also seems to reflect that. So there's a famous story where a guy, this is in the 12th century, is going across a heath in Yorkshire, and he comes across this huge barrow, which is still there today, called Willie Howe. And he looks inside because it's suddenly opened up, and there's people in there feasting. And one of them comes out and gives him a cup and says, come and join us. But he knows you never drink from a fairy cup. So he grabs it, gets back on his horse and runs off. And the fairy cup was then preserved in his family as an heirloom. And it's still there, but it's now been shown the cup is actually a glass vessel that I think was made in Alexandria or Syria and was brought back from the Crusades. But this amazing legend is attached to it.
Wonderful. That's fantastic. So we know archaeologically that that's an ancient vessel, which has now had this wonderful story attached to it. That's fantastic. Doesn't King Arthur rest under the ground or in Avalon? I can't remember the details of my reading of that, but isn't King Arthur associated with the fairy, with the elves?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, Arthur, of course, where he's buried is is subject to lots of different traditions. Glastonbury Tor is a very popular location. But yes, the idea that Arthur and his knights are in some sense between death and life, that they're not dead, they're sleeping, and that they could be reactivated. The idea that they're under some enchantment where time has ceased to operate in the normal way in a great mound under the earth. I mean, that's classic fairy motifs. And similarly, Merlin ends up being imprisoned in a prison of glass by Morgan Le Fay. So again, this sort of idea of the fairies can put people into suspended animation. And so there's this kind of survival after death. And yet it's not a happy survival after death. It's not like the bliss of the saved in Christianity or anything like that. And it perhaps reflects earlier, more primitive understandings of what life after death is like.
Do you think medieval people investigated the adventurous types, actually dug into some of these mounds and literally found gold and swords and things, and it absolutely in their minds proved that these things were real. That sounds completely plausible to me.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's almost certainly the case that that's true. I mean, if you consider the dragon in Beowulf, and that he's sitting inside this burial mound and he's got all this gold and treasure and so forth, that must reflect the way in which the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavian peoples had dug into these Bronze Age burial mounds in Denmark and found, rich treasures, which must indeed have been in there, because we know that amazing treasures have been found in more recent times inside these barrows. And we know that fairies were associated with digging for treasure, with treasure magic. People almost always in the Middle Ages and the early modern period, they would use magic when trying to find treasure, because after all, how else are you going to find it? And they would often invoke the fairies. And I suspect there's got to be a connection there. Again, the theme that keeps coming back of somebody finding a cup in a fairy mound. Cups are the main thing that you will find, or vessels of some kind, when you dig down into a Bronze Age barrow, because of course we're talking about the beaker folk. So you will encounter these pottery beakers, and sometimes you will encounter extraordinary vessels made of gold. So yeah, I think it's almost certain that this is almost kind of folk archaeology, a way of making sense of the prehistoric past. But it's also a way of making sense of fossils. There's lots of folklore associating fossils with fairies. So, for example, you've got echinoid fossils, which look like little loaves of bread, like a sort of traditional cottage loaf. And if you find them in a field, they're supposed to be the fairies' bread baked by the fairies. And if you take one home and put it by your bread oven, it will help your bread to rise. And also, of course, elf shot. So the idea that prehistoric arrowheads were found and then were said to be, oh, this is where the elves have been shooting at people. And therefore, they're associated also with fairies.
And some of those Neolithic arrowheads, from again my light reading on it, are surprisingly small. You'd sort of imagine them to be much bigger, but you don't need a very big amount of flint to be flaked to have an effective hunting tip. So that's fascinating that people sort of connected them with the fairies. And this was proof. This is hard proof in a way to a medieval person. Well, arguably, you could say it's hard proof to us as well, although we understand them in a different way. But it's hard proof to those people that these things genuinely existed. If you did go exploring and found a beaker in a mound, what more do you need to actually start ignoring the priest and go, well, no, clearly I found a cup in a mound and I know.
Yeah.
That must have reinforced their beliefs in a really interesting way.
Yeah, and there are fascinating examples. I mean, there was a Bronze Age spear that was carried into battle by one of the Scottish clans right into the 18th century. We don't know when it was found, but it was presumably excavated from something or found by accident. And that was associated with the fairies and was supposed to magically bring victory. And so you've got people in the medieval period, in the early modern period, using these ancient artifacts as magical because they associate them with the fairies. And of course, these artifacts are hardly ever made of iron. And you may remember that the folklore of fairies is very much associated with the fairies hating iron and not using iron, and iron repelling the fairies. And so if your prehistoric objects that you're finding are always made of stone or they're made of bronze, that suggests that the fairies do not use iron, and therefore they might be afraid of iron. So that's one theory, as to where that kind of phobia of iron comes from when it comes to the fairies. But yeah, I mean, the elf shot belief was very strong among the Anglo-Saxons, so they explained many illnesses by saying that elves had been invisibly shooting at people. So particularly if somebody had a stroke, for example, that was said to be the elves have invisibly shot that person. And then when they found Neolithic flint arrowheads, then, that was, as you say, simply confirmation. And right up to the 17th century, antiquarians were struggling to explain, if these aren't created by the fairies, what are they? And of course, by that point, most of the antiquarians wouldn't necessarily have believed in the fairies, but they struggled to find an alternative explanation for it. Because I think the important thing to bear in mind about people in this country had no conception of what we today would call deep time, the idea of thousands and thousands of years elapsing between us and previous cultures, because they had a view of time that was based on calculations of the likely age of the world from scripture. And so it was very difficult for them to explain a lot of the archaeology that they came across.
Isn't there some indication that the skulls of mammoths are behind the Cyclops story? Again, I don't know whether that's widely held belief, but I remember thinking that's quite plausible looking at the shape of a mammoth's skull and how it has a central hole, which is the trunk.
Yeah, there's a historian called Adrian Mayer who's made a very plausible case for this and also for the idea that the discovery of certain kind of dinosaurs in East Asia might have given rise to the myth of griffins. And I think when you're talking about Britain, obviously you've got in certain places like the Jurassic Coast, you've got huge fossil beds and enormous bones occasionally coming out of those fossil beds. And the classic explanation, certainly in the Greek world, for enormous bones was that they were remnants of giants. And in most cases, they would be prehistoric animals like mammoths, or they could possibly be dinosaur bones. But yeah, the idea that this was evidence that giants had once existed feeds into the Bible. You know, the idea of giants existing before the flood. It feeds into writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth, who talks about the giants of Albion. So when Brutus arrives in Britain, according to his mythical account, he has to slay all the giants. And you get this idea that, you know, Britain had once been inhabited by giants, which, you know, is still connected to the Cairnabas giant, for example. So, yeah, fossils and prehistory have a major role to play, I think, in these beliefs.
What about medieval people's sort of folk memory of the Romans themselves? I think you mentioned that Romans were considered to be giants by people in the medieval period, perhaps, and they didn't want to live in the villas or what was left behind. Is that something that you discuss?
Yeah, I'm absolutely fascinated by the connection with the Romans because you have to bear in mind that for centuries, right throughout the medieval period, really, people in England, people in Britain were living in the wreckage of Roman Britain. A lot of it was still above ground. We think of Roman Britain as something that's pretty hard to find. You know, you've got to go to specific places where there still remains to be seen. Not very much is existing above ground, but of course, for centuries it was. And I had a bit of a brainwave on this because I was aware of a place that is near Lydney in Gloucestershire, where there's remains of a very important temple. And this area was known as Dwarves Hill when it was first excavated in the 19th century. I was thinking, why was it associated with Dwarves Hill? What's the connection with dwarves? And then visiting a site, I think it was Richborough, I saw that the hypercaust entrances, so the stoke holes, where basically you've got your hypercaust and you're getting your hot air through these kind of arched entrances where you might light a fire or you might channel through your hot air. They look just like arches for tiny people.
Oh,
So could it be that actually people looked at these Roman ruins and they thought these are places that were built for tiny people because they got these arches? And of course, you've only got the lowest level, which is the hypercaust level, surviving, which look like rooms designed for tiny people. So, you know, that may or may not be true. It's purely speculation on my part. But, you know, could that be a connection? And yeah, the Anglo-Saxons certainly thought that a lot of the Roman ruins had been built by giants, and they seem to have had a kind of superstitious dread. We know that Londinium, for example, lies in ruins until Alfred the Great decides that he's going to revive London as an emporium in the 9th century. So, yeah, there does seem to be this strange Anglo-Saxon aversion to Roman sites, which might reflect supernatural beliefs about the Romans. And of course, a lot of the statues were still standing, and they would have been frightening. They would have been hard to interpret. And yeah, the Anglo-Saxon people might not have had a framework in which to interpret the remnants of Roman culture that they found.
and the scale of the building is often quite epic, let alone the statues being 12 foot tall. And if you didn't know that they were deliberately scaled up to be looking epic, you could argue that they're meant to be life size, and perfectly plausible interpretation that the really big doors and the really big statues indicate really big people. I think that's completely normal.
Oh, absolutely. There are examples like in Yorkshire, there's a huge relief of a god, which probably is Mars Cocidius, who's a kind of Romano-British mash-up god between Mars and a Celtic deity. But it's a huge, great big kind of relief on a rock. And sadly, now it's quite severely damaged since the 18th century. But it was known as Robin of Risingham. And it was given a whole story that, you know, he was a giant, he was a folk hero. And the idea that these kind of portrayals of gods and goddesses were giants, I think must have been widespread because there must have been many more of these images that were available and lasted for a very, very long time.
I mean, the collapse of the Roman Empire, the withdrawal of the Roman Empire from this country was, I mean, it's been widely debated, hasn't it? There's lots of ideas that maybe it wasn't that much of a change. But, you know, when legions literally march south and are never seen of again, and when infrastructure changes fundamentally, when suddenly all those people aren't here anymore because they've all gone home. That must have had a big effect on people. But I was wondering a little bit about the Robin Hood story. I think it might be quite a fun thing to talk about a little bit. Robin Hood, Man in the Green, always seems to shade into fairy stories and into the sort of stories of the elves. People argue it's based on numerous different types of outlaw robber, and it's a sort of folk memory, and throwing your fist at authority and all that kind of stuff. But it also seems a little tied in with the stories of the Fae, certainly emotionally to me. Is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, I think that that's perfectly legitimate observation. I think that with Robin Hood, the idea that he's somehow a real person or that we can find a historical core to this story, I think it's been quite successfully debunked that, there is any kind of historical core to it. And so what you're looking at is a trope, a kind of a recurring kind of idea of an outlaw who lives in the woods, this imaginary figure who lives a kind of impossible life. Was it really possible to survive as an outlaw in the woods for long? In most periods of medieval England, I'm not sure it really was.
No.
And yet he's somebody who lives outside society. So he is a bit like a godling. He's got these sort of almost superhuman abilities. He's like a superhero that he can, perform feats of leaping out of castles and avoiding the Sheriff of Nottingham. And as you say, he wears green. Now, the wearing of green was for centuries considered to be unlucky because it might attract the attention of the fairies because the fairies wear green.
Ah.
And this is almost consistent across English folklore. The fairies wear green. And in fact, when you come across a pub called the Green Man, some of those pubs are of modern vintage, but some of them are ancient and they go way back. And often today you will see the kind of the foliate head Green Man on the pub sign. But actually the Green Man originally meant the man dressed in green. And so it might well be when the Green Man is talked about, it could be Jack in the Green. It could be that man who comes out on May Day and is covered in leaves and, is sort of a traditional figure of English folklore. Or it could mean a fairy, but we don't know. But yeah, there is a potential connection there, I think, a kind of almost like a continuum of folklore there, where these fairy tricksters shade into sort of human beings with superpowers like Robin Hood.
And these all get overlain in lots of different ways in modern storytelling. You mentioned Tolkien and elves being treated in a different way. I mean, Tolkien's elves are ancient. They seem more sophisticated than human beings. So that's a bit of a spin around because they don't seem to be the wild nature spirits in the same way that the folk elves are.
Yeah, Tolkien is interesting because, of course, he knew more about this than anybody. He was a professional, he studied this literature. And he declared at one point that what he was trying to do in his imaginary world was to create a mythology for England. And so one way that you could look at what Tolkien is doing, he is reverse engineering English folklore. And he's trying to create a plausible reconstruction of what elves might have been like to the Anglo-Saxons, which we just don't know enough about.
Yeah.
We know that the Anglo-Saxons feared elves, but they also regarded elves as incredibly beautiful. And so elves have got this utterly paradoxical nature, which you encounter in some of Tolkien's, like the wood elves, for example, are pretty nasty at times, but very beautiful. And yeah, it does seem that the Anglo-Saxons had these beliefs, but the trouble is, all we've got are these fragmentary and frustrating references to elves that it's very difficult to reconstruct from. But Tolkien also invented the word dwarves, because before Tolkien, the plural of dwarf was dwarfs. But he decided that that didn't sound right, so he put in the V there.
Oh.
So we now, conventionally, we talk about dwarves, but actually that was partly for Tolkien to signal that when he talked about dwarves, he was not talking about a dwarf in the way that people might have understood it within that culture at the time, which might just be a very small human being, but it was a supernatural being or a being of a different order of nature.
I love the idea that the information we have about this world is exactly reflected in the nature of that world. The information we have is fragmentary. It disagrees with itself. It's confusing. I mean, if they existed, that's exactly the kind of information they'd want us to have about them in a way. So it's sort of beautifully circular. They're giving us just enough to make us question things. I think that's wonderful. It seems exactly very Fey to give us that kind of information to investigate them with.
No, absolutely. And I think it's a characteristic feature of godlings and fairies, indeed a defining feature of them, that they're difficult to pin down. So it was pretty difficult to write a book about them. That obviously, by its very nature, is trying to pin down who they are, what they do. But ultimately, you just have to accept that they are incredibly diverse and various, and they're cultural artifacts which can be used for a huge variety of purposes. And ancient people, medieval people, early modern people, they clearly found a use for them.
And we still do. I mean, let's face it, they feature heavily in fantasy, Dungeons and Dragons, and Tolkien's work, and the other creatures in all sorts of different ways are absolutely front and center in those wonderfully rich and colorful worlds. So that's wonderful. I've had a lovely chat with you. Thank you so much. How can people get your book? Is it released right now?
Yeah, so it's available via all normal channels for acquiring books. It's published by Cambridge University Press, and it's called Twilight of the Godlings, The Shadowy History of Britain's Supernatural Beings. And yeah, it came out in April 2023. There will at some point be a paperback release, but I think that at the moment it's currently just available in hardback and ebook.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was truly lovely. I would love to speak to you more about it. The Green Man in particular, I'm fascinated with. There was some argument I read online, and forgive me if this is absurd, is that it was associated with the resistance to the Norman invasion, that there's a certain amount of expansion of the use of the symbolism following that. And we do know that William, for his whole life, after conquering us, he didn't have an easy life for the whole of the next few decades.
Oh, yeah, this is the idea that the Green Man is somehow like the English rebel hiding in the greenwood.
Exactly.
Yeah?
Yes. Yes. So, I mean, the great thing is these ideas all tie together in beautiful ways, which probably don't make sense, yet do make sense in some ways. You know, the Robin Hood, the Fae, the Arthurian mythos, all of that is absolutely wonderful, and long may it continue. So thank you very much for taking time to talk to me.
Thank you very much.